Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for coming. I know we have a lot of new faces in the room. This is our kickoff to the Technical Advisory Committee for the. Bear with us because there's a lot of acronyms. The TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee for the Noise Compatibility Program. This is a required FAA regulatory process that we're undergoing, and again, a lot of you have heard and seen many of these items. And like I said, there's a lot of new faces in the room, so we want to make sure everybody's up to speed on where we have been, where we're going, where we are today, and some of the schedule processes moving forward. I'm going to hand it over to Jean real quick. Just a few housekeeping items. Bathrooms right down the hallway. Parking passes are right on the table. If you haven't signed in, please also sign in. I think most of you already have. And there are some comment cards and an email address too if there are some follow-up questions. I'm hoping to wrap this up in about an hour. Again, there'll be opportunity for comments, and we will go around the room too to introduce ourselves.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So thank you all for being here and giving up your night to go through this process. The process is really important to our community, to the airport, and to everybody surrounding this to make sure that we get a good understanding of what it is we're doing. We understand what we're doing, and tonight's really about going over the basis, the rules, and then as we move forward, we'll be getting into more depth discussions about what it means and how we apply it. So again, I want to thank everybody for being here, and even though we're having the meeting tonight, feel free to call anytime or check into with the airport. We want to make sure that if you don't understand something, that you get the information that you need to make sure that you can perform and that the outcome of these meetings can be the best that they can be. Can we just start right here and just work our way around and name and where you're from?
Sure. Rick Lazari, I'm the Director of Staff for the Vermont National Guard.
Good evening, I'm Colonel John Johnston. I'm the Director of Army Aviation for the Vermont Army National Guard.
Hi, Chris Milowitz. I'm the Director of Operations, so flying-related stuff across the street.
Paul Conner, Director of Planning and Zoning for the City of South Burlington.
Carmen Sargent, South Burlington resident and here as a representative for South Burlington.
Katie Mobley, I'm with the Community College of Vermont.
My name is Patrick Galvin. I'm at St. Michael's College.
Bob McEwing, and I'm representing the town of Essex.
Jesse Baker, I'm the Winooski City Manager.
Steve Wislowski, the South Burlington School Board.
David Young, Superintendent of Schools in South Burlington.
Charlie Baker, the Director of the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission.
Seth Bowden, GBSA.
Tim McCall with Heritage Aviation.
Mary Ann Rudin doing minutes.
George Manley, South Burlington resident, member of the Airport Technical Advisory Committee.
Frank Coffey, GBSA.
Kevin Dorn, City Manager, South Burlington.
Tim McKenzie on behalf of South Burlington Business Association.
Miranda Johnswell, the other paper.
Go ahead, Dave.
Dave Link, media producer.
Dave?
David Crandall with Harris Miller Miller and Hanson, Web Consultants.
I'm Diane Carter with the Jones Pain Group.
I'm Brad Duncan with HMMH along with Dave.
Brad Nicholas, also with HMMH.
Erin Denton, Business Accelerators.
Brandon Robinette, also with HMMH.
Good evening, everyone. Ron Basman, Federal Aviation Administration, the Air Traffic Control Tower and Approach Control here in Burlington.
And Sarah DeGudis, and I'm with the Jones Pain Group, the consultant.
And who's online? Can you announce?
My superintendent saying he can't hear on the phone.
Can you hear us now on the phone?
Yeah, I can hear you, Nick.
Okay.
I couldn't hear anything else before that.
I didn't miss much.
Yeah.
We were just doing introductions. Could you go ahead and give your name and where you're from?
Sean McMahon, Superintendent, Winooski School District.
Great.
It sounds like there's one more person online.
Richard, you said FAA.
Hello, Richard. Go ahead.
So it looks like most of the people in the room are part of the Technical Advisory Committee. Again, we're transitioning from what we talked last month, or the month before maybe, transitioning from the Sound Mitigation Committee, which is a broader overview of sound mitigation at the airport, to the Technical Advisory Committee, which is where we are today. This is specifically to talk about this federal process and transitioning from some of these programs that we currently have in place to sound mitigation, purchase assurance, sales assistance, which we'll get back into those details at a future meeting. But we have talked about in depth at past meetings. And really with that, I want to hand it over to our consultant team. Obviously, we're very strong in consultants tonight. Sarah DeGudis has been a project manager from the Jones Payne Group on leading this effort in coordination with HMMH on producing this document that's going to be able to transition us from acquisitions to other alternative FAA-approved programs like sound insulation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sarah to go through the agenda and the presentation. And again, if there's any questions, we'll certainly address those. And if not, if we don't have time, there's email addresses and comment cards at the end as well. So go for it, Sarah.
Thanks.
I'm just going to go to my phone because it's
Sorry.
bad.
All right, thanks everyone. So welcome to the first meeting for the Technical Advisory Committee. So we'll go through a little bit. So the introductions for this, we've done introductions. The City of Burlington and the airport are the owner and will be the primary person submitting this noise compatibility program. The consultant team, it's Jones Payne, so Diane and myself, as well as HMMH, which Dave will be speaking, and we have some other consultants on the team there. And then the Technical Advisory Committee members. So we have a pretty strong showing. I think almost every organization that is participating is here in the quick roll call for this. So we'll do that. So the agenda tonight is really just an overview of what the purpose of the Technical Advisory Committee is. We're going to go over some of the feedback. We kicked off the noise compatibility program in June with a public open house meeting. So we're going to go through a little bit of the feedback from that meeting and what we heard. We'll have a quick public forum and comment period following that. And then we're going to really dive into what the NCP is. So we have some new folks here. Some of you that have been part of the Sound Committee have heard some of this before. It'll be a little bit more in depth, and it'll really set us up for delving into those different land use measures and talking about those over the coming meetings. So Dave will be going through those for HMMH, and then we're going to go over some of the preparation for the next meeting and the anticipated schedule, which goes through the agendas moving forward, and then a comment period at the end. In order to try to keep on time, we're going to just ask that anyone hold questions until the end, and then we'll have a period for those. So what's the purpose of the Technical Advisory Committee? So the TAC is an advisory to the city solely for the purposes of the Part 150 study. So as we'll go through, the Part 150 study is two different documents. It's the noise exposure map and the noise compatibility program. We're really focusing on that noise compatibility program, or NCP, for this meeting. We're going to review the study inputs, assumptions, analyses, documentation. We're going to also look for your input and advice, guidance related to the development of this NCP. So the city will respect and consider the TAC input. They must retain, and this is an FAA guideline, that they must retain overall responsibility for the Part 150 study and the NCP recommendations. The TAC and the city recognize that the FAA is responsible for accepting any of those NEM or NCP submissions. So through this, we'll be looking at where there may be items that would be accepted by the FAA as we go through the process. So the TAC members represent the interests of their organizations and your constituents, and we expect that there's a two-way communication between the city and their organizations and constituents. All right, so So back to the kickoff for the NCP process. Back in June, we did hold an open house at the airport out in the mezzanine. I know that some of you have attended that, and just prior to that, there was a sound committee to discuss that. So that was held on June 14th. There was about 100 community members. We had 52 sign-ins. We didn't have all angles covered there, so we didn't get everyone's names. So we basically framed it as having different stations to discuss the different elements. So it was a more informal process to really allow for conversations from the community. We discussed the Part 150 history, the noise compatibility goals and options, and potential land use measures within the NCP. So the goal of that was really to see what the community was interested in. We learned that a lot of people were interested where they fall on the current contours, what the future contours might look like, what programs are available to them now, and what programs may be available to them in the future. The community really expressed interest in continuing land acquisition and sales assistance. General feedback was, with the F-35, is that going to cause too much noise to remain in the neighborhood? Similarly, a lot of people expressed interest in starting sound insulation as soon as possible. Prioritizing sound insulation for the Chamberlain School was something that was discussed with many of the community members, and also just a general sense that the community really wants to remain in the current neighborhood. The community expressed that they didn't want to see a long-range land acquisition program and an extension of the current land acquisition program. So again, we sort of had a mix of people and an equal number of people that were interested in land acquisition or sound insulation, and it really depended on their own personal stake, where their home was. And you know, if they were in favor of land acquisition, they were interested in sound insulation, and vice versa. If land acquisition wasn't available, they were interested in a sales assistance program as an alternate to sound insulation potentially. So again, this was sort of general comments. We weren't tallying specific numbers of people asking these questions, but it was a conversation to get a sense from the neighborhood of where they stood.
Sarah, can you define sales assistance and purchase assurance?
Sure. So sales assistance is a project or a program where you'd put your home up for sale, and the difference between what your offer is and the value would be provided by an FAA grant. Purchase assurance is where the airport would actually purchase the home, sound insulate it, and put it back out on the market. So either way, the homeowner would be able to sell their home and relocate somewhere else. But the property remains, versus land acquisition where the property would be demolished afterwards. And
these are programs that we're trying to pursue. We still have many FAA processes to move forward with, and of course they're the ultimate organization to approve and authorize those programs. But that was one of our introductions to the community.
And I think over the second and third meetings in particular, we're really going to go through each of these different programs in depth to really understand what they are, how they could be used in the community here. So now I just wanted to open it up to the public if there's any comments or questions that the public has.
I have one. Explain the program again that's going to do the investments in sound mitigation for homeowners that could be doing that.
So there's the noise mitigation program, which offers a number of different options for noise mitigation to the community. Currently, the airport is using the land acquisition program within that, where the homes are acquired and demolished. There's additional programs which are sound insulation, so that's both on the residential level as well as educational and community buildings are eligible for that, where there's measures taken to provide windows, doors, other measures to insulate the home itself. Additional programs are sales assistance and purchase assurance, where the home, there's some differences between those, but to the homeowner or the resident, they are able to sell their property at the market value and relocate, and the property still remains in the neighborhood and in the community versus being demolished. There's some other smaller programs as well that we'll be looking at, or some other options, noise barrier and berms, and some other different real estate disclosures and things that the program will look at in the future.
But the current program right now is the buyout program.
Correct.
And these are other options that you're considering.
Right, so the purpose of the NCP update is to really look at all of the options that are available and assess which ones the airport would like to be eligible to go after grants for.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else from public comment?
I was feeling a little uncomfortable since it wasn't you didn't do a formal gathering of opinions by people, that you would present that as almost like that they were equal. I would prefer, I guess, in the future, that if you're going to do something like that, that you do it in a manner that's going to provide a valid statistic that's going to make us really get information. Because I don't feel like that's what happened.
Okay. Yeah, and
I
I
understand what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the piece of the public, or the open house, was really to provide a comfortable atmosphere for the community to just come and discuss this. At the end, after these TAC meetings and after the draft NCP is developed, there'll be a more formal public hearing and a comment period after that. So that's where you'll get those more statistical pieces. So
Preferable, because the other one seemed more like a social event than a
Yeah.
gathering of.
And that really was like a kickoff to this whole
Right.
process. We just wanted that was really a social interaction to make sure that homeowners were aware of the programs that potentially could be moving forward. That certainly nothing set in stone.
All right. So unless there are any other public comments, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Crandall to discuss the NCP document itself. And this is the document that was emailed out to everyone 2 weeks ago, and we'll be going through that. So.
Did everybody get that email and the supporting materials, or would like to add alternate folks to their list? Everybody got it?
Good evening. Once again, my name is David Crandall. I work with HRMH. I've been working here at the airport on and off on various projects for about 10 years or so. I will be, I'll go over Chapter 1 with you, and then Sarah and I will talk about the project going forward. So, as Nick had mentioned and Sarah alluded to, there have been numerous meetings over the past few months to close to a year that have talked about the noise compatibility program in one degree or another. Many of us on the consultant team have been to those meetings. We've taken some of the input in there that we've heard there and tried to form this NCP based on what we've already heard to date, but realize that the noise compatibility program is a process. And one of the first things that we want to lay out was that the noise compatibility program will be documented, a single document with numerous appendices that cover the basis of how things arrived at how the ultimate document looks. And to try to put some concepts in front of you, we prepared the first chapter, and we've prepared a draft outline. Right now it is all draft, but it kind of has, for us that are trying to prepare this from a regulatory point of view, have all the items that we see we need to go through in this process. By all means, this is, as noted, it's draft and for discussion purposes. You have in your packet the layout of the 6 chapters that we propose to have in the document. Right now, there are some subsections in there that we are still sort of writing stuff towards and compiling many of the ideas and discussions that have been brought forward over the past few months and how that fits in with the regulatory process. We have Chapter 1 here tonight. I've also included, not in this slide, but in your packet, a list of some of the appendices that we see would be included in here, and a lot of these are right now at this point placeholders, but we do see that many of the items that we brought in here, this will help organize how we're going to put together the document and record a lot of the things that happened during this process. Chapter 1, we cover a bit of the introductory framework. Chapter 1, it's again written, it's hopefully written for someone that is coming into this for the first time. We do have a lot of references where the reader can get additional information. We talk about the regulatory framework that this program is known for, or how this program came about. This process came about through an act of Congress, quite literally, in 1979. It gave the Secretary of Transportation, United States Secretary of Transportation, the authority, responsibility to come up with a program and a single set of measurements, metrics, in order to distribute, ultimately to provide funding to local communities through the airport. And prior to 1979, there weren't really any common guidelines. Different airports were doing different things, and ultimately Congress said, look, if you want to use federal dollars, all the airports have to be on equal footing. All the communities need to be equal footing if we're going to, come use this pot of money. I do want to clarify one point that Nick made, and that is often made, is this program is ultimately voluntary, but it is the method in which federal funds can be accessed. So if the airport wants to access these federal dollars to do noise mitigation around the airport, the Part 150 process is the process to go through. So it's required to access the money, and a lot of what we talk about in terms of requirements in terms of this process is to be able to access federal funding. Forgot to mention, Congress came up with the law. They told the Secretary of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration to come up with regulations. Those regulations are what's Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 150. We often call it Part 150 for short. But Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations deals with airports and aerospace. So as far as Part 150, one of the questions that has discussed is, well, there's two different elements, which I think I get into in another slide, or we do discuss in the document, is there are two elements to a Part 150. There's the noise exposure map that documents the noise, and there's the noise compatibility program that discusses what will happen around this airport in order to try to mitigate the noise. They can be changed at a later date. One of the questions we had was, okay, we go through this process, will there be able to be changes another 10 years down the road? And yes, there can be. It can be changes in noise exposure maps. The noise exposure maps may change every 5 to 10 years. Noise compatibility programs usually change a little bit less. The noise compatibility program is sort of, okay, here's how we're going to address the noise. It's sort of the game plan, if you will. Here's a little bit of the historical perspective. The current noise compatibility program was last approved in 2008. The current program includes voluntary acquisition and the relocation program. However, in recent times, both the City of Burlington as the airport sponsor, and in particular many of the other communities have said, we want to start pursuing some other options, and Sarah expanded on that when she discussed further. So the goal of this NCP is to update the noise compatibility program to access those other elements. The existing noise compatibility program here at the airport does talk about sound insulation. It talks about it in some high-level terms, but as far as the elements of acquisition and sound insulation, sort of, if you will, cohabitating, the current NCP is a little bit silent on that. It has a little bit of overlap, and that's probably, it's one of the primary reasons that, or one of the goals that this NCP update is trying to address. Richard Doucette on the phone. Do you have anything else to mention from FAA's point of view of the need or this noise compatibility program update, or what you're expecting out of this as the overseeing federal agency? Richard, if you're there, we can't hear you. Okay, we may have lost Richard. A lot of this I already discussed. Part 150 sets forward all these standards from a federal level, and the Federal Aviation Administration oversees this process on behalf of the federal government. Again, it has two major components, the NEM and the noise compatibility program, and public involvement is a key component in both of these. And the noise compatibility program, there are a lot more specifics, especially providing the opportunity for a public hearing at the end of the process. That is in the noise compatibility program, where it's not in the noise exposure map. Here's a brief overview of the Part 150 history. I realized not all of this information is in Chapter 1, although some of it is alluded to. The airport, City of Burlington and the airport have been participating in this process since the late 1980s. I believe the initial Part 150 process may have started about 1987, 1988. And with the first set of noise exposure maps approved in '89 and the noise compatibility program in 1990. There's been numerous noise exposure map updates. Again, as the last noise compatibility program revision was in 2008. Work on that started probably just about 10 years ago. And as I mentioned, as Sarah mentioned, this is the first technical advisory committee meeting for this current NCP update. Yes.
Talk to the 2008 NCP revision.
Okay. The 2008 NCP revision, going into 2008, the noise compatibility program had land acquisition from 70 dB DNL and higher. And for those of you not familiar with the noise metrics, I'll cover that. But right now, it's the contour line that is depicted on the noise exposure map and has been presented at prior meetings. I'll go through that a little bit later. But to George's question, at the time that I believe the airport was completing acquisitions to the 70 line, and then there was, through the NCP update process, there was an opportunity to continue acquisition to the 65 dB DNL line. But at the time that was done, the sound insulation was mentioned in the prior noise compatibility program, and the two weren't reconciled, if you will. At the time, didn't seem like there was during the comment process, didn't seem like that there was going to be a need to. So roles and responsibilities, the City of Burlington, Vermont is the owner-operator of the airport. So from a regulatory standpoint, the City of Burlington is the one that would makes all the Part 150 submittals to the Federal Aviation Administration regulations clear. It actually has to be transmitted with a cover letter from the airport, has to be certified by the airport. It's not allowed to come from us, as I cannot send it to the FAA on the airport's behalf, even though I'm a consultant under contract. It has to come from their letterhead, from their office, direct to the FAA. Those are just some of the minor details in there that the regulation specifies. And the City of Burlington has required both Jones Payne Group to do this study, and HMH is a subcontractor to Jones Payne Group. The FAA determines whether or not the NCP process meets the Part 150 requirements. As I mentioned, they oversee this process on behalf of the federal government. And the Technical Advisory Committee represents the various stakeholders, local jurisdictions, operators at the airport, and along with the FAA. And the Sound Mitigation Committee, it's been a committee that's been in place for about a year, meets every 2 to 3 months-ish. So.
Question on the TAC.
Yes.
I appreciate that there's representation and you're seeking input. Can you talk about, is there a formal process for that? Is there going to be votes? Here to get, provide input outside of the meetings or only within the meetings?
So do not plan on running this by vote. I would like this to be discussion and consensus. It is to solicit ideas, and then these ideas come forward into the various chapters in the documentation. We take these ideas, take the concerns, and put them together in the noise compatibility program. And then as far as your second question?
Just, I assume that all the organizations represented on the TAC and others could provide input outside of those meetings. But I don't want to assume things because people get in trouble.
As far as a communication process, I think in order for this to be beneficial, there does need to be a document of that correspondence. We are taking minutes here at this meeting this evening. As Gene Richards mentioned earlier, I'd be happy to talk to you, but I think if there's a formal, I think a lot of the correspondence would need to be done formally because it's going to ultimately be put into the appendix and open as a public record, if that sort of assists. But we do want to try to keep this. I do understand that people walk away from these meetings and they may have some ideas, they may have some questions after the fact and go, hey, they talked about this during the meeting, I have a question on this. Well then, yes, probably send that in and we can raise it at the next Technical Advisory Committee meeting. But we want to try and make sure that this is an open process.
We do have, and the last slide has this, and it's the email BTV Sound with Jones Payne that the materials came out through today. That email address will go to me, but that's our formal record keeping, so any communication can go through that.
And just to be clear, the reason I bring that up is because many of the people in this room represent bodies, so they don't necessarily have unilateral authority to speak for that body without the body having some discussion and coming to some direction about how we should represent the body. So just want to make sure there's a way for that to happen.
Understood. Yes, and you are correct. You're going to go back to your organizations, deliberate, but ultimately, I think the communication. We want the communication to become back through the Technical Advisory Committee, just to organize the correspondences, and we don't have multiple. We don't have okay, this person represents the Technical Advisory Committee, but we're receiving communication from another part of the organization. We want to just try to keep it organized. Just that makes sense. From an organizational standpoint, prefer that the Technical Advisory Committee is a two-way conduit between the organizations that you represent in the noise compatibility program process and your peers here. I'll discuss very briefly some sound terminology. There are is not a lot of detail in Chapter 1 as it's written. We'll put that in the appendix. But as far as how the Part 150 regulations view noise, there are a lot of different ways to measure sound, to put numbers to sound. So when a lot of times the decibel is brought up as a measure of sound, but usually the decibel by itself doesn't tell you about the complete noise metric, the complete calculations that go behind that. We use the A-weighted decibel. That reflects how humans perceive different pitches. It's about 1,000 hertz. I forgot where that is on the piano. That's the peak of where humans can hear. And then higher frequencies, we start to lose being able to pick up higher frequencies that dogs can pick up, and also lower frequencies that elephants can hear. But the A-weighted decibel reflects how humans hear their sound environment. There can be different units of measurement, like a maximum. If we were to plot out the noise over time, it could go up and then down, and the maximum would be at the highest level, and then the average would be what's the equivalent average over that particular time period. The day-night average sound level is the metric that is required by the Part 150 regulation. It is cumulative in that we do look at all the events that occur at the airport over the year. It is an average because it's more of an average over time. It's not an average based on aircraft on an individual. We're not averaging over the individual aircraft events. We're averaging over the period of a year, 365 days. It does put a penalty on sounds that occur during the nighttime hours, defined as 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Generally, that's a bit more intrusive. People are trying to sleep, less background noise, so the metric does include that. And it is used with all federal agencies that deal with aviation noise in one form or another. And in this presentation, these figures are in a prior Burlington, Vermont Part 150 document from 2015, but I bring them here, and more importantly, this graphic on the left sort of illustrates how the day-night average sound level works. You have a full 24-hour period. You can have varying levels, and then the events, any sounds between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. are weighted as if they had a 10 dB penalty, and then there's the average line that goes across. So we'll often refer to 65 dB DNL. Sometimes we may say dB short, but anytime you use a noise metric term, it should properly include whether or not it's the average level or the maximum level or what context that decibels are put into. The other item that Part 150 addresses is land use compatibility. The regulation does provide guidelines of various land use categories. It does say that all land uses are considered compatible at levels below 65 dB DNL. The complete table is in the chapter that we've provided you. I have a few excerpts for the presentation, but I would again refer to the full document as far as the actual contents. It does include items such as residential, transient lodgings, mobile home parks is not applicable nowadays in the immediate vicinity around the airport, but reading some of the text, it was likely back in the late 80s, 1980s. This table, the different noise levels, is actually abbreviated, but basically, as I show, everything is considered compatible from 65 dB DNL and below, and above 75 dB DNL, most items are considered incompatible land use, and then between 65 and 75, it could be compatible, incompatible, depending on a few nuances of the construction of the building and such. Schools are listed, as are hospitals, nursing home, churches. Sometimes with churches, auditoriums, concert halls, they are grouped together as a public use or a public gathering. There is the FAA also has a noise compatibility program checklist. This is the second table in the handout. It's about 4.5 pages. Paul, yes.
Just because this is being recorded and for those who are a little less familiar, can you explain the word compatible a little bit more? Because it's, as I understand, it's sort of a financial eligibility as opposed to a societal statement, because you just described this previously being a voluntary program. Can you go into that a little bit more? That's a very loaded word.
That is a very loaded word, and I'm immediately thinking, wow, could be a very philosophical answer. Yes, the land use compatibility guidelines. Paul, I think you bring up an excellent point. And I may give a brief response now, but I'd like us to take some notes and, try to figure out maybe a little bit more philosophically deeper where that comes from. This is what, as far as items being deemed compatible, incompatible for the purposes of Part 150, it sort of states where, I don't want to just say funding takes place, but potentially actions about, potentially disclosures, or it kind of sets thresholds, if you will, but the compatible, in order to receive federal funding, it does need to be considered incompatible. That said, yes, it does need to be considered incompatible. There are often other eligibility requirements beyond that can be beyond that, such as if a property is within this within the 65 dB/DNL contour, and the contour there was a contour that said the aircraft noise was 65 at that location, and then the property is built after the contour was published, that may be considered incompatible, but it's not. After 1998, the FAA won't pay for mitigation for that property. So it's sort of like a prerequisite to funding. So probably didn't completely answer your question, but you started to answer the question in the context of compatibility and funding, and there's a little bit more beyond just incompatibility being a funding requirement. Amanda.
From the FAA's perspective, it's just on one side of a contour line or on the other side of a contour line?
It also depends on the building's construction. Depends on what its use is. And some items in particularly in schools, gymnasiums, they won't fund mitigation in gymnasiums. They'll fund mitigation in classroom spaces. So it is more compatibility, incompatibility isn't the sole decision on the funding requirement, but it's sort of a prerequisite for, it's one of the prerequisite to receive it. And
fair to say that its principal use is related to funding?
I think in the context of this regulation, it's fair to say it is one of the uses. There could be others off the top of my head. Richard?
Yes. Richard Giuseppe here. I think the term compatible to me means that once the noise levels reach that level, if people find it objectionable, they can tap into federal funding for mitigation. It doesn't make it automatic. Some people don't find the noise objectionable even at that level. Most people do, but some don't. But it does make you eligible for certain forms of mitigation. And the question about, is it just a matter of the home being across the line or not. When making funding decisions with public money, there has to be a line somewhere. And the way we interpret that in the New England region is typically if the 65 DNL noise contour crosses the property, we deem that property eligible, unless it's a really, really big, strangely shaped lot and maybe the house is several hundred yards away, which is typically not the case. There are times when we do what is called block rounding, when you have, say, 70–80% of the homes in a neighborhood are inside the line and are eligible for mitigation, and just a couple of houses left, we can decide to make those homes eligible. That's a decision we make on a case-by-case basis. And the last thing that sometimes trips people up is if you have a relatively new home or one that is very well built, maybe it has a lot of insulation in the walls, maybe it has very good windows. People do that usually to save energy and to keep the heat in the house. Sometimes homes are built well enough that additional sound insulation, which is typically just new doors and windows, would not be effective in reducing the noise further. So there's typically a acoustical testing program that precedes the sound insulation program, and we test a sample of all the different types of homes in the neighborhood. And certain homes, even if they're inside the 65 DNL line, will not qualify for sound insulation if they're built well enough that they already have that necessary insulation built into it. And that can be very difficult for some people to accept, but that is the way the program runs.
Kevin?
I think a lot of people in our community have looked at those terms, and I think Paul asked a great question. Look at those terms and they think it ties into health impacts, incompatible for health reasons. That's not what I'm hearing here. I haven't heard those words brought up either by Richard or you, but I think in the community, because we've had people come to us and say, our home needs to be bought out because I've got children who are having health impacts. That's not what I'm hearing here about the use of these two terms.
Yes.
It's unfortunate people have that belief, but the FAA does not perceive it as a health impact, no.
Thank you. Thank you.
George?
Well, I do know that the Noise Mitigation Act of '79 was tied to the Noise Act of '72. The '72 basically set down a couple of thresholds. One where if you were exposed to a 90 dBA weighted or greater for 24 hours, it would amount to permanent hearing damage. And the other was basically if you're exposed to 55 dBA weighted or greater LAV 24, basically noise average over 24. It was taken as an invasion, if you will, of your property where you could not normally enjoy the use of your property, okay, on the outside, possibly on the inside, depending upon how it was built, but not necessarily the outside. Again, that was 55 dBA weighted LAV 24. The whole premise, if you look at 89, the Noise Mitigation Act of '79, where FAA, or the federal government said, hey, look, FAA, you got to come up with a uniform means of either measuring and or predicting the noise, the sonic curves and noise about the airport. Part of that threshold of 65 was based on 1972. And if in fact you take LAV, 55 dBA weighted LAV 24, and calculate that flatly, you and I have had this discussion, right? It's about 65 dBA weighted DNL. So there is a correlation there between what the FAA did to establish for a threshold where you were either annoyed, inconvenienced, or otherwise versus the Noise Control Act of '72. And the other thing too is I believe the formula uses SEL. California uses CNEL, right? The community noise equivalent level. The formula for the 65 dBA weighted DNL uses the sound equivalent level.
California, the CNEL metric has a little adjustment for evening hours.
Right. But nevertheless, right, in California, their thresholds basically are less than out here. And in fact, a number of them don't use 65 DNL. They use 60. So if you look at that table, my gut tells me that table is purposely vague or flexible, however which way of the fence you want to sit on, to allow us to determine, what the various sonic sound curves are that we use to consider for different forms of mitigation, whether they be land acquisition, sales assistance, sales, whatever, those sound insulation programs, whatever. And it is flexible. So from a compatibility standpoint, there's some room to wiggle there. And the other two, in all honesty, from a litigation standpoint, the whole land acquisition program under the Uniform Relocation Act for Displaced Persons was actually set up to avoid inundating the courts with litigation for land takings or eminent domain. And again, those figures right there basically establish certain sonic contour points to allow airports and communities, if you will, to coexist. So there's more than what meets the eye here when you look at incompatible and compatible.
Yes, and there is a history about how these values came into place. Last slides before that. Okay. And then moving on, the chapter does have the Part 150 checklist. Part 150 checklist is essentially a document that the FAA put together from the that has all the key points for the regulations to sort of you look at the regulations sort of in an applied format. And when they receive the document from the airport sponsor, the organization that owns and runs the airport, it's their checklist to go through and say, does this document meet all the requirements of the regulation? So that is about 4.5 pages. We include a copy of that, and as the document progresses, we will fill in which chapters various items are addressed in. And one of the other items I did want to mention is the fact that the checklist doesn't, one of the items it does has is there a provision to revise these documents at a future date? So it does ask that question, and that has been, again, one of the questions that I had heard, that go through this noise compatibility program process. Are we tied to this process, or can it adjust in 10, 15 years as the environment changes? Chapter 3, we have not, we are still finishing up a few of the details on that. This will provide an overview of the noise compatibility, the existing noise compatibility program. I think we are trying to get this out to the Technical Advisory Committee in about a week or so. It is broken down into 3 sections: the operational measures, monitoring and review, and the land use measures. Many of these items go back to the late 1980s and what was initially approved by FAA, I think in 1990. But we'll provide an update on the status of these measures. Yes, George.
Dave, on the first 2, operational measures and monitoring and review, did you not, when you put together the noise exposure map, have to make some various assumptions with regards to departure and approach flight paths and runway uses?
Yes.
You had to?
Yes.
Will those be included at all, or any of those assumptions be included at all to the Technical Advisory Committee for consideration?
We will review what the existing measures are. We'll review what the status is as far as the detailed specifics about the runway use that we found in the last noise exposure map. cite that back to the noise exposure map itself. Again, the noise compatibility program tries to say, this is what we would like to do, this is what we'd like to do, and the status that we'll provide is, here's how currently doing with respect to that.
But one nevertheless builds on the other and actually
Yeah.
establishes some material fact for consideration for noise mitigation in the future.
Yes.
So those assumptions become fairly important.
Yes, and some of the items, like I put airport infrastructure, because the one of the taxiways on the north side of the airport was mentioned in the noise compatibility program in the original edition, and that taxiway is.
The grant is received and Amanda's kicking that off now, actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
construction started.
So some of the projects that were mentioned 30 years ago are starting to come to fruition. Some of them were for noise, some of them for, a variety of reasons. The noise compatibility program mentioned its benefits. So that's why it's sort of split up like that. Okay. And then the existing discussion of the what it formally says on the land use measures as it's currently written. And with that, that's what we've provided. That's an overview of the text that we've provided. With that, I'll turn it over to Diane Carter to talk about easements.
Good evening. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So just to answer your question earlier about the Technical Advisory Committee and how the process is going to work, this discussion on navigation easements is where we're starting that process. So what you'll get from us before every meeting is an email with a bunch of information in it for you to review. We'll come to the meeting. We'll be discussing items, and navigation easements is a big topic of discussion for our December meeting. We'll have that discussion, and then the following meeting, we'll follow up with what we heard, what we think the consensus is, and bring that back to the committee so that there's a full circle discussion happening. So I'm just going to preview for you, and I don't need to read the slides, what navigation easements are. There has been a lot of discussion in the Sound Committee about navigation easements. It's a legal document that is conveyed to the airport from a property owner in exchange for something of value, whether it's sound insulation or a cash money, a check. That is what an easement is. And a lot of discussion about what is in the actual legal document. And so we will be sending out to you on Monday, early next week, along with the Chapter 3 document, several navigation easements that are currently in use here in New England. So you can see them from Bradley Airport and TF Green in Rhode Island and Tweed, New Haven, to see the different types of languages that are used. They can be very broad and say it's noise, it's light, you're giving the right for noise, light, emissions, overflight, obstructions if there are trees that are too tall, and then it can be very narrow too. This is for noise only. So we want you to have a chance to look through those documents, review them, come prepared with questions at the next meeting so that we can get a consensus and some feelings about how people feel about the language in those easements to bring back to the airport and to the FAA. And so that's how the process is going to work moving forward. This is just a sample. I know it's tiny and you can't see it, but it was emailed to you. So this is one of the easements you will be receiving from us. It is something that the FAA does like to see, particularly with mitigation programs like sound insulation, that there is an exchange of value. They liked him because when the homes sell, even if it remains residential, that easement travels with the property. It does not go away with the sale of the home. So it provides sort of a disclosure notice to future owners that they're moving into an area where there's noise impacts. And I think that's it. I just wanted to touch on that briefly. Did anybody have any questions, George?
Real quickly, any examples of the navigation easement for either schools or municipal buildings?
We did not plan to send that out, but we can get that for you. We can include that in the package. That's a great suggestion. Yep.
Buildings, thank you.
Just sort of a context question here. Presumably, a resident, just not necessarily here, just in general, would prefer to have the fewest elements on an navigation easement. What are the metrics by which as a noise compatibility plan is put together, a airport and a host community consider what should and shouldn't go in? What's the value? What are the sort of...
How does that discussion happen?
Not sort of how does the conversation happen, but what's the grounding point of why X and not Y?
Right. I think you'll see with the easements that we send that are in this area, they're all fairly similar in the same type of language. We know that the FAA is comfortable with that. Sometimes you will see airports where there's a large concern about large, tall trees, and they want to get those trees removed because they might be off the runway ends. And sometimes in communities, they'll say, this is a noise project. We want to worry about noise-related issues in our easement only. So it's really a sensitivity issue between the community and the airport and what the concerns are. All right, great. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah. We'll wrap this up.
So briefly, again, this is a preliminary schedule. We've tried to outline topics that we'll be looking at in the upcoming meetings. One thing to note is, as we go into topics, we may take more time with others, so there may be items that get shifted. So looking at that, as we talked about, we'd be looking at Chapter 3 and easements for the next one, as well as Chapter 2, which is just the existing accepted NCP. That should be not NEM. The meeting is scheduled for December 5th. Moving forward past that, we'll be really looking at the different items within the operational measures, monitoring and review elements, and then really getting into the land use measures. So land use measures is the reason that we're updating the NCP primarily. So we're looking to look at sound insulation in tentatively a January meeting. And then looking at the remainder of the land use measures in a fourth meeting. We may have a fifth meeting. Again, it depends on conversations, how the process works, what feedback is, and where there may be concerns. And so that's, again, tentative schedule. We'll keep everyone posted and see how we work through the process. And then, as I mentioned, if there are comments that come back, btvsound@jonespain is the email that you're receiving from me for these meetings with the agendas and with the meeting materials. If you have any follow-up, if you can send that to that email address, then it is that central point of distribution and communication for things. And if there's any other questions, I think we have a little bit of time for that. So, Kevin?
I have a question probably for Nick or for Gene. I wrote a letter 3 weeks ago asking that the City of South Burlington City Council have the final say in what goes to the FAA and the NCP for those items that affect South Burlington. We feel a majority of the council feels uncomfortable that decision is left with the staff as it relates to investments made outside of airport property. In other words, under the insulation program and others. The council would like to have an opportunity to comment on or otherwise control what investments are made in our community. I didn't hear a response back from that letter.
Yeah, I don't think it was 3 weeks ago, but we will definitely respond back to you.
I'd like to, that's a pretty straightforward question, and I'd like to find out before the next meeting, certainly within the next couple of weeks.
Sure.
What the answer is to that.
Sure.
That's
Responses en route to you,
great.
absolutely.
A straightforward question. I think our community's elected representatives should have the final say in what goes to the FAA, following the process.
Yep.
And through the sponsoring organization, which is the airport in the city of Burlington.
Yep.
You have the final say on what investments are made in our community. I'm not talking about what you make on your property. I'm talking about what's made on South Burlington outside of
And I think through the TAC, this is a great opportunity for you to relay that to your city council as well, and to bring back to the TAC meetings in the future. And it, like I said to you before, a response letter will be entered to you shortly.
Thank you.
It's also a good opportunity, Kevin, to show up at these meetings and make your thoughts and comments, and they'll be discussed. We certainly have looked at your letter and reviewing it. But I think this meeting and the meetings in the future are really the opportunity for you to express your ideas and concerns, and anything that has merit or we're able to do it, we're certainly going to entertain that.
And we also want to bring in the actual homeowners of the community as well, understanding that you're the city of South Burlington and representing this municipality. But on the other end of that is the homeowners themselves that need to be a part of this conversation.
Well, and I'm
as
not
well.
the decision maker in the city council. And so this is a policy matter for them. And I think that their role should be paramount here, as it affects us, as it affects Winooski. Winooski should be in their city council, or Williston, their select board, should have the deciding say in what goes forward. And so, that's my response.
Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So I think what I heard earlier was that ideas were going to be brought forward and we would discuss, and then those ideas would be culminated into whatever the Burlington Airport decides to recommend. So I'm looking at this and seeing in the March meeting, we have a bunch of ideas, and to the argument or question Charlie made earlier about us each representing boards, I think, or councils or select boards, I think one of the things that might be helpful is to have a fifth meeting, go over what those options are, allow us to go back to our boards, and then come forward at a fifth meeting with actual responses from our policy setting
That's very
boards.
fair. Yeah, absolutely.
Additionally, just to throw a flag on that concept, you're also asking us to do that in March, and I understand that's how the calendar worked out, but for those of us representing municipalities, that's also when elected boards change. So we're gonna have new city councilors and select board members coming on and pretty much at their first meeting, asking them to get very up to speed, even if we do a lot of work between now and then to educate our city members. So I might even ask like a 6-week window, so we could have 2 meetings between or something like that.
I think just in terms of the March schedule, and I think that's where saying that this is preliminary, that is something that's on our radar. At the same time, we also want to make sure we're moving the process forward. So I think as we move forward and as we're looking at these, again, if we go back, we have a December 5th meeting. We wanted to have a date for that, but I think it's having a conversation as to what the speed of this is and making sure that we're avoiding any pieces.
And that's a good point, Jesse. And what's not on there too is what the conclusion of this is bringing it to a large, open public meeting. And presenting it to the public and receiving a public comment period back as well.
Can I ask one other question? Unrelated. Sorry, Paul.
I've taken my chair.
At our June 13th meeting, we talked about the new noise exposure map, and my understanding was that an application was going to be put in at the end of July and that we'd hear back from at the end of September. Have we heard anything? Is that going to be feasible in the next year? And for context for the room, the why that's important for the city of Winooski is that the NCP will be built around the prior noise exposure map that doesn't take into consideration potential future impacts to the city of Winooski. So even if we launch these great new initiatives, the map will change and our residents may not have access to that.
Yeah, an update to that is we're moving away from the grant process and trying to access funding that we've already been granted. To do that, we just have to reallocate some funding sources and then fit that noise exposure map update within the whole, if you will, of an open grant. We're working with our federal partners on that.
We did not get the funding yet from the FAA. The request was made and we haven't received the funding, so no so far.
When would you like feedback on chapter 1?
So again, I think it's an open piece. If you want to provide written feedback, that's fine, and then we'll have, or if you want to save it until that December 5th meeting, if there are pieces to that, then we would look for feedback at that point.
Really the entire process.
So, Yeah.
Right, and I guess I'm just sort of following up from Charlie's question of, assuring that,
Right.
I really appreciate the presentation this afternoon.
Right.
If this is gonna be a committee that provides feedback, we also need
Absolutely.
our job is to make sure that we've read stuff in advance and actually give you feedback on things.
Correct. Yeah, and I think with chapter 1, it's more of an overview. There's a little bit less that's up for, not discussion, but it's more of sort of the overview, the history, and there's less discussion in terms of new measures or things that may change. So in terms of that homework and a discussion on that, it was a little bit less important. When we get to the next meeting where we're looking at the easements, for instance, we'll really start to delve into that. We'll be providing information about sound insulation before the following meeting, and that's where the meatier topics get in. But to your point, we're open to getting written comment back or having a point of discussion during the December meeting. So, yep, George?
One of the things that I think people in the community are going to need to know are the ramifications associated with getting into either the sound installation program, sales assistant, or the purchase with the easement. And what happens if, let's say in the sound installation program, they decide to participate and they're found, not worthy, but able to participate. And then subsequently, down the road, they have an opportunity to sell their home, right? So the FAA and or through the airport just invested, let's say, for round numbers, $30,000 into their house to improve the sound insulation or sound mitigation properties of the home. And now they have an opportunity to sell the home. What does that mean to them by their participation in the program? Those are kinds of things that I, as a homeowner, and I know my fellow neighbors, are going to they're going to want to know, right? So I have actually 4, possibly, if you include land acquisition. So I have these programs before me. I not only have to know what they are, but I also have to know what my financial buy-in, and impacts are in each one of those programs if I decide to take other action other than staying, okay? So those need to come quickly, I think.
Right. Right, and I think that there's 2 steps to it as well. There's looking at what measures the airport is putting forward in the NCP, and then following that, there's actually an implementation plan for noise mitigation. So there's the public hearing process to see what the community wants in general, and then there's those conversations with the homeowners as to what's available, how the phasing of different programs will work, and how that would all work. So,
and I understand, but what I'm telling you is that before I can make a decision to know what it is that I want, I need to understand the details of the programs that I am considering.
Right.
So how can I tell you, I think I want to participate in the sound installation program? That sounds interesting. I want to stay.
Yep.
That sounds like it would be the most beneficial to me.
Right.
How do I really know that? I don't.
Yeah.
And we'll be delving into that here, so that.
But you understand what I'm saying, the request for input, when we go out and we ask our constituents, our fellow neighbors what they're interested in, we need to make available for them as much information as we can so they can make the best informed decision.
No, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and that's where all these land use measures, when we get into those, we're gonna get into the nitty gritty of what that means and how those work. Yep.
So does I'm jumping too far ahead, but that's what I do, so I'm sorry. Mainly concerned about the sound insulation, the various programs for the residents, the schools, the municipalities. Will the FAA allow multiple programs to go on at the same time? And if not, why not?
So I think part of the program, and I'll use sound insulation within the schools and residential as an example that's come up. The school is about halfway between the contours. It's not the most affected. It's not at the highest DNL. Part of the program for the NCP is looking at how that would get phased. As part of the NCP, we're looking at the budgetary dollars for each of these programs and coming up with an overall phasing scheme for that and how the programs would would get laid out. So you may have sound insulation of schools, residential, and sales assistants occurring over the same period of time. So there are going to be a lot of conversations about prioritization and what can happen before what can't happen before what, as we get into the different land use measures.
Does the FAA allow multiple programs to happen simultaneously is the question, and if not, why not?
They do. We're basically, when it comes to mitigation, we're looking at two options. Land use that does not change, it remains residential.
Right.
And if that is the case, then you can do sales assistance or purchase assurance or sound insulation or easements all at the same time. You know, there could be a Chinese menu and the homeowner can choose what they would like. Where there is a land use measure, where there is a land use change, which is land acquisition, then we typically like to see in the FAA, and as Richard has expressed in the past, he would like to see, you know, where that line is drawn, because you don't want to be purchasing one house and the next door is sound insulation and then the next door is bought. We'd like to either look at a land use change or look at the land use remaining the same. But there can be multiple programs offered.
I know when this meeting was originally scheduled, it was supposed to be last night, and which is for a couple of us the same night as our city council or select board meeting. I just wanted to thank the airport and the consultants for being flexible and changing the meeting. It was super helpful.
December 5th is a Tuesday.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does December 5th work for the majority or everybody so far that we can tell? And we'll push that out next week as well, just as a reminder, and maybe get some projected dates in the future.
Yep.
And going forward to those future meetings, I think to the extent you are looking for some feedback on some, specific issues, just remember, like all of us that are going back, we're not gonna get an hour on our board agenda to talk about the same topic. So if there's, the key pieces that can be summarized in, a couple pages, or a page or two, maybe one page.
Right.
The key question that we're looking for an answer to that month.
Right.
And I'll open the door as well here. If anybody on your board or anybody's board or you individually want to come into the airport to learn a little bit more, to have specific questions, we're available to do so as well.
And I think that.
But just recognize we need to have a group conversation on our tables that are focused and constructive for what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we can help with that.
If anything anybody needs here separately or different or one-on-one, please let us know, because your point is well taken. We want to make sure that each and every one of your boards and your bodies are well digested so that you can come here and represent them in the best possible way. And the only way to do that is to, if you need extra time or you want to come in, we're going to make it available to you. And it's really important that you understand it, and where we're going, and so that you can make that decision.
Okay. Anything else?
I just do want to say, they asked December 5th if I will not be able to make it. My wife and I are expecting, but that is one reason why we have a very large contingent here from HMH. I've worked with many of you for several years. It's been great. But these gentlemen, Brad Nicholas in particular, will lead our team at HMH. As I have some personal matters that I'll be needing to attend to. I will be woken in the middle of the night quite a bit. But anyways, I want you to know you're in good hands. It's a lot of you asked questions tonight. I'm like, no, I know my point. Names, but
Should we expect to see you later on, or are we not going to see you?
I will probably be in the background.
The answer is yes.
I realize I have a lot of history, and I'm going to be more in the background supporting our team as opposed to being up front. So it's going to be a role switch.
Can I just mention one more thing? This program is for the people, that are surrounding the airports, not necessarily for you as the leaders. It is for the people that it's going to have effect to. So it's really important as I think you said, Charlie, is, that we do go back and we find a way to connect with our communities. And it's not just the angry people, it's everybody, so that everybody's represented long-term. This program, as you know, like the last one, it's going to be around for a while. So make sure we're communicating and talking to everybody, not just the people we want to hear from, but everybody. That's really important so that this program is successful. It's not your political agenda. It is what benefits your community. It's the community at large, not your personal issues. Thank you.
So, again, I'll be sending out information early next week. It'll be the chapter, the easement information, and just a confirmation of the date. So if everyone can just check their calendars, and we'll see you in December. So,
Thank you,
thank
everybody.
you.